lot of people were living in Kuomintang areas and could see what was going on. What was happening in communist areas, we didn't know anything about.
Indeed, with the collapse of the Marshall Mission, the Civil War escalating, and the U.S. clearly on Chiang Kai-shek's side, Mao's forces were no longer so welcoming to American reporters, as Seymour Topping discovered when he tried to cross into communist territory.
At a roadblock, we encountered communist guerrillas, and that was the closest call I had. One of them was pointing a machine gun, a Tommy gun, at me, and kept yelling at me, "Who are you?" And I could see his fingers on the trigger of the machine gun, and so they took me as a prisoner.
Meanwhile, with the help of Henry Luce, Roy Rowan got an interview with Chiang Kai-shek.
Chiang Kai-shek did not grant interviews to the press, but because of Luce, he agreed to see us in Beijing, and the madam served as the interpreter. He tried to convince us that he had things well in hand, and they had big wall maps and pointers and, doing the whole dog and pony show for us about where the nationalists were in Manchuria, where the communists were, and how they were going to had a very, very good defense set up and so forth.
Manchuria, or northeast China, was the country's industrial heartland and a key agricultural base. The communists and nationalists had been fighting over it for months. Having heard Chiang Kai-shek's confident boasts, Rowan and Burns set out on a China Air Transport, or CAT, plane for the Manchurian city of Mukden, today's Shenyang, to see the situation for themselves.
So we went right from that meeting with Chiang Kai-shek, hopped one of the CAT planes and went up there, and then found us. As soon as we landed, we could see that everybody was trying to get the hell out of town and evacuate anybody with any money. Troop trains were going by with nationalist soldiers hanging on the outside all over the engine, moving south.
The communists were at the city gates. In downtown Mukden, at the U.S. consulate, they found American diplomat Angus Ward, a larger-than-life figure who'd been ordered by Washington to stay on and establish contact with the triumphant communist forces.
The epitome of an international spy, fluent in several languages, Chinese, Russian, very imposing. We took pictures of him, talked to him, I guess, for an hour, and he finally, you could hear gunfire. He finally said, "You better get your asses out the airport." And luckily for us, CAT always kept one plane at all of these airports where there was fighting going on, and to get their last guys out, their own guys.
Rowan and Burns got the last flight from Mukden's chaotic airport. They realized they had an exclusive. No one else knew the city had fallen. It was a story even Henry Luce's Life magazine couldn't ignore. Rowan and Burns got a 5-page spread. But U.S. diplomat Angus Ward was imprisoned in his consulate by the victorious communist troops, held hostage for 18 months before being allowed to return home. It wasn't only in North China that Chiang Kai-shek's authority was unraveling. Doak Barnett was the China correspondent for the Chicago Daily News. As Mukden fell, he took a trip from Shanghai through southern China.
Stopping off all along the way from Shanghai to Canton, and we got off and we saw an enormous number of people of all kinds, and at the end of that trip I wrote a long piece saying there's just no basis for any resistance anymore. There's no basis on part of it. The officials we met had lost total confidence in the ability of the regime to survive. The intellectuals had lost total confidence, and ordinary people had lost total confidence.
And we saw the wounded being hauled back from central China and just dumped off the train.
And it was that more than it was the loss of Mukden, as far as I was concerned. I mean, it was just clear that politically there was no basis anymore.
With the communists in control of the north, the battle for central China began. Hoping to cover it, Seymour Topping went to a town called Bungbu, where he spent Christmas 1948 holed up in a Jesuit mission.
I would report to Harold Milks, who was in Nanking, about what was happening and so on. And on Christmas Eve, after I had filed one of my last reports, Harold Milks wrote a brief story saying that Seymour Topping is the loneliest man in the Associated Press this Christmas Eve.
By now, Audrey Ronning, whose father Chester remained the senior Canadian diplomat in Nanjing, had been evacuated back to Canada.
And I was walking down the street one rainy night and with some friends going to a movie. And I kicked over a newspaper that was on the street. And it went into the gutter. I picked it up, it was the Vancouver Sun. And on the front page, there was a little box that said, "Perhaps the loneliest man in the world tonight is Seymour Topping. The loneliest man in the world this Christmas Eve was Seymour Topping, who's in a monastery in Pengpu." And I thought, oh my, I better write and answer his letters.
Soon after, the two were married. What became known as the Huai Hai campaign in central China lasted 65 days. It involved over 1 million men, the biggest land battle since World War II, and it was a decisive victory for the communists.
That morning in January of 1949, on the battlefield of the Huai Hai, I knew it was all over for Chiang Kai-shek.
There was not a conflict among the press at all on the nature of the conflict. We knew that the nationalists were done, that they had done themselves in many ways. There was no hope for the nationalists, and it was impossible for the United States to turn the tide.
I was positive by this time that the nationalists could not prevail. There's no way. There so much corruption. So many of the generals were going into combat and selling their arms and taking the payrolls and depositing it back into their own bank accounts in Shanghai. Not too long before it was over in China, Luce called me back for lunch. I went all the way back for lunch. It's a long way to go for lunch, especially when you're flying in prop planes. I told him what was happening. I told him he was gone, actually.